when business came to depend on investment, you had to weigh various possible future outcomes. When marriages ceased to be arranged, you had to speculate on the merits of potential mates. And the novel, as it was developed in the 18th century, provided its readers with a field of play that was at once speculative and risk-free. While advertising its fictionality, it gave you protagonists who were typical enough to be experienced as possible versions of yourself, and yet specific enough to remain simultaneously not you. The great literary invention of the 18th century was, thus, not simply a genre, but an attitude toward that genre. Our state of mind when we pick up a novel today, our knowledge that it's a work of the imagination, our willing suspension of disbelief in it, is in fact one half of the novel's essence. A number of recent scholarly studies have undermined the old notion that the epic is a central feature of all cultures, including oral cultures. Fiction, whether fairy tale or fable, seems mainly to have been a thing for children. In pre-modern cultures, stories were read for information or edification or titillation, and the more serious literary forms, poetry and drama, required a certain degree of technical mastery. The novel, however, was within reach of anyone with pen and paper, and the kind of pleasure it afforded was uniquely modern. Experiencing a made-up story purely for pleasure became an activity in which adults, too, could now indulge freely, if sometimes guiltily. This historical shift toward reading for pleasure was so profound that we can hardly even see it anymore. Indeed, as the novel has proliferated subgenerically into movies and TV shows and late-model video games, most of them advertising their fictionality, all of them offering characters at once typical and specific, it's hardly an exaggeration to say that what distinguishes our culture from all previous cultures is its saturation in entertainment. The novel, as a duality of thing and attitude toward thing, has so thoroughly transformed our attitude that the thing itself is at risk of no longer being needed. On Masafuera's sister island, originally named Masa Tierra, or Closer to Land, and now called Robinson Crusoe, I had seen the damage wrought by a trio of mainland plant species, maki and murtilla and blackberry, which have monotonously overrun entire hills and drainages. Particularly evil-looking was the blackberry, which can overwhelm even tall native trees, and which spreads in part by shooting out runners that look like thorny fiber-optic cables. 2 native plant species have already gone extinct, and unless a massive restoration project is undertaken, many more will follow. Walking on Robinson, looking for delicate endemic ferns at the blackberry's margins, I began to see the novel as an organism that had mutated on the island of England into a virulent invasive that then spread from country to country until it conquered the planet. Henry Fielding and Joseph Andrews referred to his characters as species, as something more than individual, less than universal. But as the novel has transformed the cultural environment, species of humanity have given way to a universal crowd of individuals whose most salient characteristic is their being identically entertained. This was the monocultural specter that David had envisioned and set out to resist in his epic Infinite Jest. And the mode of his resistance in that novel, annotation, digression, nonlinearity, hyperlinkage, anticipated the even more virulent and even more radically individualistic invader that is now displacing the novel and its offspring. The blackberry on Robinson Crusoe Island was like the conquering novel, yes, but it seemed to me no less like the Internet, that blackberry-born invasive, which instead of mapping the self onto a narrative, maps the self onto the world. Instead of the news, my news. Instead of a single football game, the splintering of 15 different games into personalized fantasy league statistics. Instead of The Godfather, my cat's funny trick. The individual run amok, every man a Charlie Sheen. With Robinson Crusoe, the self had become an island, and now, it seemed, the island was becoming the world. I was awakened in the night by the beating of the sides of my tent against my sleeping bag. A big wind had blown up. I deployed my earplugs, but I could still hear the beating and, later, a loud whapping. When day finally came, I found my tent partly disassembled, a pole segment dangling from its fly. The wind had dispersed the clouds below me, opening up a view of the ocean, startlingly close, with dawn breaking redly above its leaden water. Mustering the particular efficiency I can bring to the pursuit of a rare bird, I ate a quick breakfast, packed my knapsack with the radio and the satellite phone, and enough food for 2 days, and at the last minute, because the wind was so strong, collapsed my tent and weighted down its corners with large stones so that it wouldn't blow away while I was gone. Time was short. Mornings on Masafuera tend to be clearer than afternoons, but I made myself stop at the refugio and mark its coordinates on the GPS unit before hurrying on uphill. The Masafuera rayadito is a larger, duller-plumaged cousin of the thorn-tailed rayadito, a striking little bird that I'd seen in several forests in mainland Chile before coming to the islands. How such a small species landed 500 miles offshore in sufficient numbers to reproduce and subsequently evolve will never be known. The Masafueran species requires undisturbed native fern forest, and its population, never large, appears to be declining, perhaps because when it nests on the ground it is prone to predation by invasive rats and cats. Ridding Masafuera of rodents would entail capturing and safeguarding the island's entire hawk population and then using helicopters to blanket its rugged terrain with poisoned bait at a total cost of maybe $5 million. I'd been told that the rayadito isn't hard to see in proper habitat. The difficulty is in getting to the habitat. The heights of the island were still in cloud, but I was hoping that the wind would soon clear it out. As well as I could tell from my map, I needed to ascend to about 3,600 feet in order to skirt 2 deep canyons that blocked the way south to Los Inocentes. I was cheered by the fact that the hike's net altitude gain would be 0, but almost as soon as I'd left the refugio behind me, the clouds closed in again. Visibility dropped to a few hundred feet, and I began to stop every 10 minutes to electronically mark my location, like Hansel leaving crumbs in the woods. For a while I held to a trail marked with mule droppings, but the ground soon became too stony and scarred with goat tracks for me to be sure I was still on it. At 3,600 feet I turned south and bushwhacked through dense, dripping ferns and found my way blocked by a drainage that ought to have been below me by now. I studied the map, but its Google Earth shadings hadn't become any less vague since the last time I'd studied it. I tried to work my way laterally around the sides of the canyon, but the fern cover concealed slippery rocks and deep holes, and the slope, as far as I could tell in the fog, seemed to be getting more vertical, and so I turned around and struggled back up to the ridge, orienting myself by GPS. An hour into my quest, I was thoroughly soaked and barely 1,000 feet from where I'd started. Checking the map, which was getting very wet, I recalled the unfamiliar word that Danilo had used. Cordones. It must mean ridges. I was supposed to follow the ridges. I charged uphill again, stopping only to scatter electronic breadcrumbs, until I came to a solar-powered radio antenna, presumably a local summit. The wind, now stronger, was blowing cloud over the backside of the island, which I knew to consist of cliffs plunging 3,000 feet down to the seal colony. I couldn't see them, but the mere thought of their proximity gave me vertigo. I'm very afraid of cliffs. Fortunately, the cordon leading south from the antenna was fairly level and not too hard to pick my way along, even with high winds and near-zero visibility. I made good progress for half an hour, feeling elated to have deduced from scant information the right way to Los Inocentes. Eventually, however, the ridge began to branch, presenting me with choices between higher and lower routes. The map indicated pretty clearly that I should be at 3,200 feet, not 3,800. But when I followed the lower ridges, trying to reduce my elevation, I reached sickeningly precipitous dead ends. I returned to the high ridge, which had the added advantage of heading directly south toward Los Inocentes, and I felt gratified when it finally began to descend. By now the weather was really bad, the mist turning to rain and blowing horizontally, the wind gusting above 40 miles an hour. As I picked my way down the ridge, it began to narrow alarmingly, until I found the way blocked by a small pinnacle. I could sort of make out that the ridge continued to descend on the far side of it, albeit very steeply. But how to get around it? If I scrambled around its leeward side, I risked being grabbed by a gust of wind and blown off. On the windward side, there was, for all I knew, a sheer 3,000-foot drop, but at least on this side, the wind would be pushing me against the rock rather than pulling me off. In my rain-filled boots, I edged out along the windward side, double-checking every foothold and handhold before relying on it. As I crept forward and was able to see a little farther, the ridge beyond the pinnacle began to look like another dead end with nothing but dark space ahead and on either side of it. Although I was very determined to see the Rayadito, there came a moment when I became afraid to take another step, and I was suddenly able to see myself, spread-eagled against a slippery rock face, in blinding rain and ferocious wind, with no assurance that I was going in the right direction. A sentence so clear that it seemed almost spoken popped into my head. What you're doing is extremely dangerous. And I thought of my dead friend. David wrote about weather as well as anyone who ever put words on paper, and he loved his dogs more purely than he loved anything or anyone else. But nature itself didn't interest him, and he was utterly indifferent to birds. Once when we were driving near Stinson Beach in California, I'd stopped to give him a telescope view of a long-billed curlew, a species whose magnificence is to my mind self-evident and revelatory. He looked through the scope for 2 seconds before turning away with patent boredom. "Yeah," he said with his particular tone of hollow politeness, "it's pretty." In the summer before he died, sitting with him on his patio while he smoked cigarettes, I couldn't keep my eyes off the hummingbirds around his house, and was saddened that he could. And while he was taking his heavily medicated afternoon naps, I was learning the birds of Ecuador for an upcoming trip, and I understood the difference between his unmanageable misery and my manageable discontents to be that I could escape myself in the joy of birds, and he could not. He was sick, yes, and in a sense the story of my friendship with him is simply that I loved a person who was mentally ill. The depressed person then killed himself, in a way calculated to inflict maximum pain on those he loved most, and we who loved him were left feeling angry and betrayed. Betrayed not merely by the failure of our investment of love, but by the way in which his suicide took him away from us and made the person into a very public legend. People who had never read his fiction, or had never even heard of him, read his Kenyon College commencement address in the Wall Street Journal and mourned the loss of a great and gentle soul. A literary establishment that had never so much as shortlisted one of his books for a national prize now united to declare him a lost national treasure. Of course, he was a national treasure, and, being a writer, he didn't belong to his readers any less than to me. But if you happened to know that his actual character was more complex and dubious than he was getting credit for, and if you also knew that he was more lovable, funnier, sillier, needier, more poignantly at war with his demons, more lost, more childishly transparent in his lies and inconsistencies, than the benignant and morally clairvoyant artist saint that had been made of him, it was still hard not to feel wounded by the part of him that had chosen the adulation of strangers over the love of the people closest to him. The people who knew David least well are most likely to speak of him in saintly terms. What makes this especially strange is the near-perfect absence in his fiction of ordinary love. Close, loving relationships, which for most of us are a foundational source of meaning, have no standing in the Wallace fictional universe. What we get instead are characters keeping their heartless compulsions secret from those who love them, characters scheming to appear loving or to prove to themselves that what feels like love is really just disguised self-interest, or, at most, characters directing an abstract or spiritual love towards somebody profoundly repellent, the cranial fluid-dripping wife in Infinite Jest, the psychopath in the last of the interviews with hideous men. David's fiction is populated with dissemblers and manipulators and emotional isolates, and yet the people who had only glancing or formal contact with him took his rather laborious hyper-considerateness and moral wisdom at face value.